Well, I've written 20 books in 53 years, and I don't think that's terribly prolific, is it? It runs about, on the average, 3 years for a book. I'm somewhat of a maverick historian, and I have some specialties, but if you ask me what my main interest is, it is what's called, it's probably a big word, historiography, history writing. I mean, how do we know things? How we ought to research them? That's really relatively the easiest thing. And then how and what we're going to write. That is exactly right, and this is very essential. This is a theme that ties together these otherwise very different books. Let me put it very simply. This has absolutely nothing to do with psychoanalysis, you know. I'm not interested in why, what is the depth in which people think this or that, but how do they think? Because thinking is a conscious choice. I'm not interested in subconscious. I don't even think the subconscious exists. The unconscious exists. But this idea that something deep down is the true thing, that's very Freudian, very Germanic, you know. I'm interested about what and how people think, which involves a conscious choice. We're responsible for what we think. That's a fairly good summary, you know. But let's now not talk about thinking, but about history. As we move gradually into the modern age and the present, it becomes more and more important. We still live in an age of materialism where it is taken for granted that the only important things are what happens with matter. And people's thinking is wrapping this up and packaging their experiences. This is just about completely wrong. What happens is inseparable from what people think happens. Now, the two may not be identical in the long run, but what happens, whether it's pain, whether it's pleasure, whether it's the price of a stock, whether it's the success or the failure of a political figure, is not only conditioned, but determined by what people think. Well, it's a book with the title 5 Days in London. It seems to be a good title because the book is doing pretty well. My wife said it's going to be put in the travel section. 5 days in London, you know, $60 a day, you know. Well, we didn't do that. It deals with something that I have been very deeply interested in for 40, 50 years, and I've written other books about these 5 days, but never a book-length thing. These are 5 days in May 1940, a little less than 60 years ago. And why is it so interesting for me? Because I'm convinced, and I'm glad that I was able to pass on this conviction to my readers and reviewers. This is when Adolf Hitler came very close to winning the Second World War. Well, the only person in his way was Churchill, who had a family, who did not only have what we attribute him with courage and a splendid employment of the English language, but he had a fabulous understanding of Hitler, of what Hitler was about to do and what Hitler was not about to do, and this was an enormous help. It was a matter of genius. On the other hand, or at the same time, you may have a wonderful understanding of someone, but if that other person is stronger and more brutal, you're not necessarily going to win. And Churchill's judgment, his position, his reputation at that time was still rather low in England, especially in political circles. It's a long story, especially among the Tory party. Hitler, who was no dummy, he knew that. And he thought that, so, all right, Churchill had become prime minister a fortnight before these 5 days begin, but he's not going to last. The church is going to fall. There are a lot of people in England, he thought, wrongly, and especially in the Conservative Party. In this he was only half wrong, was still wrong. We're going to get rid of Churchill. Cadogan was a very intelligent man. We know a lot about Halifax through him because he was Halifax's undersecretary in the Foreign Office and kept a rather detailed diary. And Baldwin and Chamberlain didn't like Churchill either. There's plenty of reason before that. Churchill was a maverick, Churchill was impatient, Churchill was impetuous, Churchill was half American, Churchill drank a lot, Churchill spoke a lot. These are all things that the staid English, with a fair amount of reason, did not trust. Churchill, well, I never met him. I did go to his funeral, 1965. Because I was in France at that time as visiting professor, and my son was 8 years old, and I said, he ought to come and see this. I went to his birthplace on the 100th anniversary of his birth, but it wasn't a special, I was in the neighborhood. I was working on a book called The Duel in the German Library of Institute of Contemporary History in Munich, and Munich was a 2-hour trip from where Hitler was born. Oh yes, and the principal German newspaper asked me to write the article on the 100th anniversary of Hitler's birth. So I went there, had an interesting 2 days, Braunau, an interesting 2 days. Then they did not publish the article. They thought it was too controversial. I don't know, it's not a big deal. They paid me. Well, I don't know. I'm really rather conservative, even though I hate this term now, because everybody's a conservative now, you know. I'm really too much. But, well, unorthodox only in the sense, a great English historian in the 19th century said, and I'm going to lean on him, he's going to help me, an orthodox history is a contradiction in terms. And let me tell you why. You see, history and the law are different things. In the law, especially in Anglo-Saxon law, Anglo-American law, you can only judge a person once. There cannot be multiple jeopardy. In history, we constantly judge the person again and again and again on the basis of new evidence or on the basis of a different perspective. So in a way, all history is revisionist. There are 1,000 biographies of Lincoln. There's every reason to believe that yet another will be written. And it may be even interesting, not necessarily only because this researcher found a new stack of Lincoln documents or the diary of Mrs. Lincoln's hat maker, but he has a different view. And unless the view is stupid, one-sided, ideological, cracked, it's a significant book. This is going to go on and on and on. And you know why? You don't have to be a great genius to... we live forward, but we can only think backward. Yes, and Brian Lamb interviewed me. I don't go to television often, and I dread it usually, but it doesn't happen too often. I can live with it. And he was so nice and so intelligent that it was most pleasant. Well, two things, a short run and a long run. The short-run thing was that I had a book finished, a book that's very close to me, very close to me. A Thread of Years had a publication problem because the company that gave me the contract for it, the book was almost finished, went out of business because of a merger and so forth. In other words, the company did not honor the contract. So this book, which is very close to me, Thread of Years, was gathering dust on my desk for year after year. So I thought I want to do something else, you know. And I was always interested in Hitler, but I'm not a Hitler specialist, about the different way people see him. This is really not a biography of Hitler. This is a study of the problems that still exist, which the more than 100 historians of Hitler, some of them saw them right, some of them saw it wrong. This is what the book's about. Yes, but it's not really a biography of the writers. It's really a study of the biographers, and then 7 chapters of different problems about that man that are still pending. Oh, we talked about this a little bit with Brian Lamb. Well, I want to tell you, everything that's evil has a spiritual element in it. I mean, there's nothing in our lives that's 100% carnal or 100% spiritual. It is always a coexistence of both. And one thing about Hitler was that, as you know, Hitler had some very, very strong dislikes and hates and ideas. But to mention one thing, Hitler was not a sadist. You see, some of the sadists, that's a weakness of the flesh. That's a weakness, you know. A sadist takes pleasure of inflicting or watching somebody being tortured. Hitler never did this. You see, Hitler never wanted to see any pictures or almost any information of what was happening to the Jews. Because he didn't want, he wasn't this kind of person, you know. This is not because he was modest and so on. And toward the end of his life, on one occasion, he actually says, you know, the Jews are not really a race. They're a spiritual race. Which is very interesting, because people think, many think, that Hitler was an absolute racist. Yes and no. They brought him racist books. Some of his success, some of his officials, Himmler and so Rosenberg, wrote about the super race. Hitler said, that's no nonsense. I don't know. Probably from television, I don't know. Oh, the biggest misconception is that he was mad. No, I mean, if he was mad, if he had been mad, he would not be responsible for what he did. Oh, yes, well, that's just standard. They do this in Europe anyhow. You know, they change from, in the summer, British time is continental time. In the winter, British time is an hour behind. Well, yes, I said that we won't have, well, I'm not a prophet. I said that we probably won't, well, it's not a thesis of the book. We won't have wars like the Second World War again, but the essence of the book is, which has a relationship to the new book, is that the decisive period of the war, Second World War, occurred before Pearl Harbor, before the United States entered the war, and even before Hitler attacked Russia. See, between 1939 and 41, the war was almost exclusively, not entirely, fought in Europe. And that's when Hitler could have won it. After December 41, he can no longer win it. Oh yes, I mean, this was probably the last world war. We're probably going to have all kinds of troubles, but no world wars. I don't know, I shouldn't have said that. Let's put it this way, I mean, history does not repeat itself. This was the last attempt of the past 500 years of a European state, European power, to establish complete domination of Europe and thereby become a world power. The Spanish tried it in the 16th century. The French tried it in the 17th century and half 18th century. The Germans tried it twice in different ways in the 20th century. That was the last attempt. Yes, we followed the war I was living in Hungary. I was born in Hungary, loved the war very, very keenly. My mother was a very beautiful woman, a very intelligent woman. She was glued to the radio. She knew English, which was rare in those days because the second language, Hungarian, was French. She was an Anglomaniac, from which I profited a great deal because she had me taught English, which today would be perfectly standard, but at that time was very rare. From the age of 5, sent me to school in England. And I remember something that still something brings tears to my eyes, and I hope it won't do it now. On the 7th of December, or actually on the 8th of December 1941, I went to what you would call a prom, a dance. I was the equivalent of a freshman at the university. I came home at 2 o'clock at night. The light was on. My mother, she said, America is in the war.
America is in the war.
Yes. Because we knew that Hitler was going to lose it. I didn't cry then. I was 18, yes. Yeah. But something moves me about this, seeing her there. She was in bed. She had a Telefunken radio which picked up shortwave, She was listening to BBC. I'm sorry about that. No, once in a while. I don't know why I brought it up. Well, my parents were divorced at that time. It was already rare at that time, but my father shared my mother's views. Yeah. I had a stepfather, yes. Oh, it was a fairly not very rich, well-to-do, very safe bourgeois existence, yes. Well, an existence where you have a great, which is still my ideal, where you have a great amount of comfort and only occasional luxury. Oh, I don't know, a trip to Riviera, or have a very expensive dress made, or get a fancy car. Well, that's a generalization, but it's by and large true, You said, you're very kind to read all these books, these books don't impress me. I write books out of my system. Anyhow, but you said that I'm well known. Well, I'm not well known. I'll tell you, this comes back to the upper crust. Somebody, not I, it's a very good witticism, said, what is the definition of a celebrity? Celebrity is somebody who is well known. And I said, this is a slight exaggeration, that my ambition is to be, celebrity is somebody who's famous for being well known. My ambition, I said this, I mean a lot of it. I want to be famous for not being well known. I came to the United States 23, and good God, that's now 54 years ago. Yes, I just turned 76, and I must say this is not a number that I particularly enjoy. It's too big, 76, I had a big birthday party at my 70th birthday, and I said, that's it. Well, at home, in great comfort. I live what is still country, was getting very suburbanized, about 35 miles west of Philadelphia. I liked it. Well, 2 things. I married my first wife, who died very young, lung cancer. Their family place was around there. But oddly enough, even though I was born in a city and brought up in metropolis, I somehow always wanted to live in the country. Well, I had a job there, and then I met my first wife, and then and her father gave us a small piece of land, sort of, for a wedding present. And that's where we built our first house, yes. Oh, I was a professor of history in a small Catholic college, a girls' college in Philadelphia called Chestnut Hill College, and I was there for 40-odd years. I'm a stick in the mud, you know. I'm living in the same place for over 40 years, yes. Well, they were not kids, they were undergraduates.
Undergraduates.
Well, yeah. Well, I want to tell you something. It had its ups and downs. Well, there were all kinds of reasons why I stayed there for long, but one of them was that, to me, the most important thing is where you live. I liked living where I lived. So I wasn't looking for higher prestige jobs. I'm not saying I would have gotten one, but I wasn't too eager to leave. Yes, it's funny you should mention, because yesterday I just went through the proofs. Well, I is a conservative publication. I am not really a conservative. You don't have to put people in categories, okay. You know. I mean, everybody's conservative now. But they've been very nice to me, you know, because they know I'm not a leftist, not liberal. And they are publishing these guides for students. And they asked me to do this. They pay a little money for this. It's a very small, a guide to the study of history. I've just finished it. It's going to come out, I think, 2 or 3 months from now. They're going to print 10,000 copies and give it out to students, so-called conservative students. I think it's all right, although I think that somebody who is 18 years old, and there's many 18-year-old young men today fairly ignorant, he shouldn't call himself a conservative. Well, he's too young to. He doesn't know what to conserve. Oh, they are not. Well, all these terms, I'm not dodging the question. All these terms today, conservative and liberal, are rather outdated. I can only tell you who, in my opinion, is not a conservative.
Okay.
George Bush. Neither of them. I would say the only man, I'm not watching politics, who comes close to being a conservative is Alan Keyes. Yeah. Not that I'm all for him. Yeah. Now, and McCain has a conservative element in them, and in a way Bradley has a conservative element in him. In a way Gore does, very little, but about something that's very important. Nature and the environment. And we have these conservative, so-called Republicans, so forth, who are not interested in the environment. They're not interested. What do they want to conserve? You know, they want to conserve the Wall Street Journal. It's true. That's what I said, and that's what I mean. That's why I sometimes call myself a reactionary. Oh, there are a fair number of people. I mean, and to use a relatively cheap quip, but I didn't make it. Once you don't react, you're dead. You have to react against many things and many ideas, perhaps especially nowadays. And you have to know what's worth conserving and what is not worth conserving. Well, that's another word that has changed its meaning. You know, liberals 100 years ago were people who believed in very little government. And then liberals took on the welfare state and so forth, and not in everything, not in censorship and so forth, but became the partisans of more and more government. And you see, I see here that you had a program on Tocqueville, who's a very great man. Tocqueville, 165 years ago, said, this is a new world, and the new world requires a new vocabulary. You know, the old terms don't fit. Well, 165 years ago, the old political vocabulary, conservative, liberal, began not to fit. We are 165 years later and people still use it. incorrectly. Or, well, not completely, but partially incorrectly. Let's put it this way, less and less correctly. I'm not speaking of correctness, that's less and less accurately. I had a correspondence. I was very, well, now, here is a true conservative. Yes, yeah. I mean, to the core, with all the virtues and with almost none of the vices of any political ideology. I was very impressed with him. I was in this country. I had been in this country 6 years. He was ambassador to Russia. I wrote him a letter. He answered me. We have been corresponding since. And of course, then I met him. Now I see him once more. You know, he'll be 96 on the 16th, and his mind is still very good. And our wives know each other, they're friends, you know. I'm going to go over see him before his birthday. I think my wife is going to send homemade jam or something like that. And he is an extraordinary, he's a very great American, and we now correspond less, you know, because writing letters. But I must have 200 letters from him. Yes, there's a touch of a trick in it, you know, because my friend Richard Snow, who's an editor of American Heritage, wanted have an interview, letter, Kennan and I talking to each other about the origins of the Cold War. And we decided that both of us are votaries of the written word. Let's do it in letters. So this is an exchange of 6 letters. Well, because both he and I, and we are very different, are this way. You know, I think it clears our minds when we put it in writing. Well, that's a very intelligent question. The 2 books ought not to be compared. Goldhagen's book is terrible. Bottom line, terrible. I mean, narrow-minded, one-sided, unresearched. Whatever researches he took from others, you know, it's a sensationalist book by somebody who is both prejudiced and ignorant, which is a bad combination. Ian Kershaw is very different. Ian Kershaw is an English medievalist who became interested in Hitler's sort of midlife in his career, and he is writing this big biography of Hitler, of which only the first volume has been published in this up to now. And he has a difficult task, and I would say his book is very good. Now, you said that they deal with the same things. In a way they do, because Kershaw wrote studies and other books on Hitler before this book, and he was really interested in what I could sum up in 2 words, Hitler's popularity. Actually, Goldhagen doesn't deal with that. And Kershaw is very good about this. I think Kershaw still, there are some things I don't agree with in Kershaw, but I think it's a very good book. The first volume, the second volume I haven't seen yet. I know him. And there's a good chance that this, you asked about Orthodox before, this may be certainly one of the few great standard books about Hitler. He has to deal with that. How come that this man was so successful? How come this man was so popular? Because he was successful, he was popular, and among a people who are one of the great peoples of the world, who were at that time probably one, if not the most educated people of the world. The German schooling, you know, was such. I mean, these were not primitive people. Well, anybody hears this, he would say, with every reason, that this guy is just, you know, hot air. He's generalizing. You must understand the context in which this was written. Yes. The context is that I was in Budapest, a destroyed city, at the end of the Second World War, and I saw the Germans and I saw the Russians coming in. And this is how the Russians behaved as a soldiery, and so forth. And even this was not so typical. Years later I found out that this particular group of Russian divisions came through Hungary were, even by the Russians, regarded second-rate. But they certainly were very barbarian, I mean, in their behavior and everything. And this is really from a memoir I had of those times. So don't think that these are generalizations that I just threw out and involves the German and Russian people at large or at any time in history. Oh, my dear, I can't tell you. Well, I can tell you one thing, though. And I used to tell this to my students writing papers with very little success. Write with your ear. You write a sentence, say it to yourself. Does it sound right? I try to do that. No. Oh, I didn't say. I said he was not a sadist. You know, a sadist, for example, might not even hate his subjects. Oh, Hitler was a hater. Hitler would say, I would say this is just about the most damning thing, one of the most damning thing I have in this book in my research, early Hitler speeches, early Hitler statements. So it says, yes, we hate and hate and hate, and God gave us the talent to hate, you know. Now, just think about this. Hating somebody may be an abstract thing. You know, hate is not necessarily carnal. You know, hate is a spiritual element, like contempt and so forth, you know. You know, hate doesn't give you physical pleasure. Oh, I don't know, he was a very bitter man, and yeah, he learned how to hate. But, you know, let me jump ahead or jump back. There is a Kipling poem of the First World War, I forget which. I have a great admiration of Rudyard Kipling, an English poet, who really, in personal life, was a very mild-mannered man. He has a poem, two lines come to me. The Hun is at the gate. It's when we learned to hate. And this was an Englishman. And I'm sure that Kipling, if he met a German prisoner of war, he would not hate him. No. A prisoner of war who is wounded in hospital, you know. I mean, hate is a very complicated thing. Yes, I guess so. He learned how to hate, and he knew, and he expressed this. Mein Kampf has a fair amount of hateful things in it. He wrote it when he was kind of a prisoner intern, 1924-25. He actually didn't write it, he dictated it. I don't know. Oh, I think I was a young man in Hungary. I read it, I don't think I read it through. And I tell you what I thought. Now this will shock your listeners. I was appalled by it. I also tried to read Marx. Couldn't read him. I could read Hitler. I thought, this man is not the better, but the more powerful mind of the two. Marx put me to sleep. Whatever I read, I don't think I ever finished it. Very. Well, let me first say that I'm very touched by your interest, and Donald Detweiler is a very good and close friend of mine. He's actually mentioned in the acknowledgments of my Hitler book. I don't think you're right about this. I would say there are a fair number of non-liberal American historians now. There's a fair number of them even in the past, and there are good and bad ones among them. I do not believe that the liberals or the leftists have a monopoly in American history writing. So, you know, this political correctness thing exists. Often they have a very strong influence, nearly a monopoly in some history departments, especially since the 60s and the 70s, but that's not very serious. That will pass. American ones or British
As you
ones? Well, there are many good ones, all over the world. This interesting thing is that there is the novel, for example, is in very bad shape. There are fewer and fewer important novelists, but historians exist in every country, and a fair number of good histories being written. Well, the matter is broader than this. And oral history has its merits. Of course, it all depends on the quality, who is talking, what is he saying, is it recorded, for what purpose. But if there's any question of oral history, it relates to this much bigger question. Is history only the recorded past, the written past? There are a lot of people, almost everybody thought that 100 years ago. There are a lot of people, historians, who still think that history is only the recorded past. No. History is the recorded past plus the remembered past. Now, the remembered past sometimes has expressions. Oral history is one of them. But the view that history is only what exists in records and in official records is a very outdated view. Oh yes, and let me tell you, in this so-called information age, which is kind of a lot of nonsense, this is even more difficult because you see, one of the rules of, and it's still accepted, of the historical profession was that a good historian has to go into primary documents. Primary document. Let me give you an example. A letter from Lincoln, even a note to Mrs. Lincoln saying, you ought to hire a new maid. Lincoln wrote, it's a primary document. A book written about the Lincoln household, the household of Lincolns during the Civil War, which mentions this in detail, is a secondary document, secondary source. I mean, this, like so many other distinctions, is now washed away. Eisenhower is the first president who very often did not write letters, did not even dictate letters, did not even sign some of his letters. So you see a letter signed by Dwight Davis, and I don't mean a Christmas card, It's a primary document, but it is less valuable than a letter you found in an attic of your grandmother's honeymoon in Niagara Falls. First of all, I said there's no final decision. History is rethinking things over again. You have to use your judgment. It, like everything else in life, it is a choice. Life is a succession of choices. You have to decide not only what you're going to do, you have to decide not only what you're going to drink, you have to decide what to think. I shouldn't tell you about private things, but I don't know why I'm going to do it. I am thinking of writing a book about the end of the modern age. And now I'm thinking of writing a book about the end of the modern. Well, the modern age is something that started 500 years ago. The discovery of the globe was around other continents, and the white race and Christianity and the European powers settling other continents. That was just one thing about a new view of the universe. This age is gone. It's not only past. Well, nothing is gone forever. You see, mankind has a much longer lifespan than individual life. A lot of the things in the modern age, a lot of achievements in the modern age, like the Constitution of the United States, for example, the scientific method, modern medicine is still going to go on for a while. But this age that was characterized by so many things, and this is not the point, there is no space or time to go. We can see that this age has come to an end. And it's really in a way, one of my least important books. I am not a Holocaust specialist, but I know a lot about Irving. I know about this suit, again a coincidence, because some English friends of mine sent me the clippings in England. Of course, the essence of it is that in England, it's much, the English libel laws are much stricter than American libel laws. And why are they sending this to me? Because Irving has threatened to sue me too. Because in the Hitler of History I have 2 pages about him where I try to cite chapter and verse saying that he's a bad historian. You know, I'm not saying that here. I'm not pressing the point that he's sympathetic Hitler or neo-Nazi, which is probably so, but I'm pointing out where he says things, and the Holocaust is not even mentioned there, that are really not verifiable. He's a very tricky historian. He's an amateur historian. There's nothing wrong with that. Winston Churchill was an amateur historian too, you know. But this is a very tricky thing. He's defending himself in London. It's very interesting how this case is going to come out. Well, you asked 3 questions, 3 very big questions. Let me answer them backwards, and I start something very frivolous, you know. Umberto Eco is a strange phenomenon. He is an Italian who's mostly unreadable. Well, I can't read him, and Umberto Eco is a terribly intelligent, and sometimes he writes very well, kind of a literary clown. So I think whatever he says about Hitler and the Jews, I mean, you might as well write about Hillary Clinton or Dior fashions or whatever it is. All right, forget about him. Second question is circular reasoning. No, I will not accept this. You see, we have advanced to a point, and actually this has actually medieval origins, that a person who is mad is not responsible of what he does and what he says. And this is exactly why I insist that Hitler's decisions and acts and words were conscious, you know, and that's why he is more responsible than if we consider him abnormal and mad. By doing this, we not only relieve him of responsibility, but we are brushing the whole thing under the rug. We don't even think about it. This was a mad episode. It was a madman. Not going to happen again. You know, I mean, this is not circular reasoning. This is really looking at it in a normal, common sense way. Now, your first question was, I did not say that Hitler was not a racist. Everybody's a racist to some extent, but he was a very secretive man, and we have now, which I didn't think we had 20 or 30 years ago, certain evidences from his private expressions and so forth that he did not take the whole racial ideology as seriously as, for example, Himmler did or Rosenberg. He has contemptuous remarks about them. Again, this makes him more responsible, not less. Calais was an impossible situation, and poor Nicholson, who fought rather well, was captured in Calais, and he died in a German prisoner of war camp. Yes, because I think he deserves some credit. Who was a very brave and a very dedicated and principled German who stood up against Hitler and tried to get rid of Hitler and was executed in the conspiracy. This is 5 years or 80 days, and somebody said to me, is your next book going to be 3 hours in London? I said, no. Well, I only know about Haider what I read in the paper. I think Haider is a less devoted person to his career than Hitler was. Haider is kind of a yuppie, a mixture of somebody who does have some pro-German neo-Nazi sympathies, but he is an ambitious yuppie politician, and I don't think he'll get very far. On the other hand, there is perhaps this similarity, that the more noise people are going to make about Haider in Austria, the more local support he will have. You see, people have, sometimes with reason, sometimes with not much reason, a standard inclination to feel that they are being mistreated. And this also happens with people who are not mistreated at all. Now, the Germans were mistreated after the First World War. And this general widespread feeling or sentiment or even conviction, it was a conviction, among other, had some basis to it, and it greatly contributed. It did not alone make it, it greatly contributed to Hitler's success. And this is perhaps the only similarity. If people will keep badgering the Austrians and all that, and perhaps they ought to be criticized, I think it's going to redound to Hitler's benefit. Oh, I can't. I'm not a problem solver. Amazingly, my books, I have per capita the two countries where my books sell best are Sweden and Hungary. Considering population, in Sweden, last book of mine sold about 6,000 copies. Sweden has 7 million inhabitants. That's the equivalent of 200,000 in the United States. In Hungary, they sell about the same, on the average 6,000, 7,000, 8,000. Hungary's a population of 10 million. That's the equivalent of 150 million in the United States. Oh, darling, what is life like in Valley Forge? I don't know. It's, I mean, a fair number of people live a much better life than they lived during the communist system. A fair number of people mess up their lives, you know, which has very little to do with the political or the economic system. I mean, life is not an easy proposition. Oh, I was very young then. I think there was a point where I can't really tell you. There was a point just about May 1940, without knowing any details, where I thought, Christ, the Germans might win. It didn't last long. Would have been very bad. Yes. But you see me breaking out in tears when but it's not, you know, when this comes back to me. You know, in Hungary, life was very difficult, you know, and I had some Jewish ancestry, Jewish relatives. I was working for the Allies here and there, you know. I survived without much difficulty. No, I would have stayed in Hungary. Then the Russians came in, then there was a transitory period where the Russians did not yet, or the Stalin did not yet impose communism on Hungary. It was gradual. But I knew it was coming. And I was very much against it. And I had this great advantage due to my mother, that I knew English. And I did some work for the British and the Americans toward the end of the war. So I had some privileges. I could, you know, Hungary still had a democratic government. But the Interior Minister, the issues passport, was already in communist hands. I didn't get a passport. I had to leave illegally. But the Americans told me, once you get to the West, actually to Vienna, which was a 4-power occupation, you give this letter to someone, you get a visa to the United States. That was it. That's what happened, yes. In Portland, Maine, because I hardly had any money, and I finally got some passage on an American freighter, Liberty ship, and there was a strike, the stevedore strike, all over the eastern ports, and so this ship could not unload in New York, had to go to Portland, Maine. October. No, it was chilly. Well, sometimes people try to do that. I don't mind it, you know. Why do I pronounce it Lucas? Because it's great to my ear, because they cannot pronounce it the way it's pronounced in Hungary. It's probably Lukacs. Yeah, in the moment you say it, it's not right. Yeah. Oh, yes, it's spelled the same. I'm not changing my name. I come from a very decent family. The English have this thing, you know, they have family names and they pronounce it a certain way, and then eventually people accept this. Well, I think it was 8:30, but never mind. Well, I'm very touched by this because I've been thinking about this for a long time, and I did not throw this out as an aphorism or a quip, you know. I mean, there's a difference of somebody who thinks of himself that he's an American or a German or an Italian who just happens to be Catholic, but this is secondary. And there are people, a minority, who think, I'm a Catholic, as I am, who happens to be an American, and whose religion, or what he tries to believe, and what he believes, is deeper and superior than his citizenship. That was what the whole thing was about. And I'm very touched. You see, teaching is a very wonderful thing, because you never know, as in the case of this young woman, what is it that made an influence on people? You never know, sometimes the strangest things. And the very fact that I said this, and this remained at least lodged in her memory, touches me very deeply. Yes, but it's a private matter. Well, it impacts in the sense that I will not say that I'm a very good Catholic, because, very simply, as a private matter, because anybody who says that he's a very good Christian is already a sinner. Just think what Jesus said about the Pharisee who said, I'm a very good, all right. But it had, because to me there is accumulated through 2,000 years, a Catholic view of human nature, which includes the sense of original sin. That's why which I, relatively early in life, impressed me, and I became convinced that this is a very sane and a very healthy and a very true view or approach to human nature. And in history we deal about history is the knowledge that human beings have of other human beings. How can it not influence you? Oh, delectissimo, oh, that's nice. That it means to my darling Stephanie, it's my wife. Yeah. No, I really don't understand this, not because I don't want to understand, but I really can't. Well, it's a very big question, but let me talk to Buchanan first. I read his book with great interest. I actually reviewed it. I reviewed Buchanan's book in a very conservative publication called Chronicles. I think it's in November, December, you can see it. Buchanan's book, and this is true about Pat Buchanan himself, has many reasonable things in it, but there are also things in it that are very wrong. I cannot go in detail. The interesting thing is that the most reasonable things are what he proposes American foreign policy should be now. You know, I would say I agree with a lot of them, but I mean, this is now. But his view of the history of the 20th century is skewed by his personal inclination, not really prejudice, inclination, that it was wrong for the United States to fight the Second World War, it was wrong for Britain to fight the Second World War, and something that touches me. It's very interesting. I mean, Buchanan is a conservative. Buchanan, often very rightly, criticizes Woodrow Wilson's foreign policy, which had a lot of intellectual inheritance, you know, that often very questionable. He criticizes Franklin Roosevelt, but his real dislike is Winston Churchill. You know, in this book, you know, he excoriates Winston Churchill, and it's not because I admire Churchill, I do, but why? Because Churchill, but how? Churchill was this is what 5 Days in London is about. Churchill was the only person who stood in Hitler's way. I don't like this. I don't like this. This tells something that I find, it smells. Fairly well. This is a good debate. He writes fairly well, you know. I mean, but this is a selective indignation. All right. Now the other question is, all I want to tell you, sir, is this: world history is enormous, and you must understand, history is not only written by historians. What you should do is find a topic that interests you and start reading in it. Go to the library and see. Even look at the book, say, this looks, I'm not going to read this. I'm going to read this. And then go on and on and on. You seem to have an appetite for history. The appetite is more important than the cookbook. A cookbook will not give you an appetite, but an appetite might start you cooking. Well, in the early 80s, that's a very bad, this is one of the instances where I gave in to my then editor, who was a very good one, and it's not a very good title. But it is an attempt, it was an attempt, to write a history of the United States in the 20th century in a way some of my books are written in layers. It's not just a political history, it deals with economics, material things, ways of life, politics, foreign policy, art, literature. It's one of my least known books, and I really don't think it's that bad. Yes, because Tocqueville was a very great man. Yes, Tocqueville reversed. I'll tell you why. That's very glad you answered this. Or you asked me this. You're really very good. You're too good for me. Yeah. Next time we should have a dinner in candlelight. We talked about this. You see, Tocqueville wrote this book. It's a very honest title, Democracy in America. It's not a history, because at that time, 1830s. The United States was the only country with a democratic constitution, with a by and large democratic society. There was slavery in the South, but still, all right. But today, 150 years later, when I wrote this book, vast numbers of countries and nations in the world call themselves democratic, and they are. So does Hyder. Hyder was elected, 33% of the vote. And you see, Tocqueville reversed, because today we can say there is American democracy, which is different from Mexican democracy, which is different from Japanese democracy, is different from Irish democracy, different from German democracy. And my book wants to emphasize what is particularly American in American democracy. It's a Latin quote from Horace, integer vitae salaris scripturis, which translated in English mean a life of great integrity and untouched by blemishes. This is a little confused what this lady says, but what people ought to understand and really know it, that we cannot eliminate prejudice. Everybody has prejudices. Very young children prejudices. And I'm going to make a shocking statement. Prejudice is the beginning of knowledge. You have a prejudgment. Then the most important thing is, what do you do with it? Do you allow this prejudice to categorize all the views we have of people or world, or are you willing, on the basis of experience or evidence, to overcome this prejudice? Prejudice is a natural state, even a baby's mind, human beings are not born with a blank mind, especially not nowadays. You see, a 3-year-old child today has already heard more voices, more music, more sounds than our grandmothers had when they were 60. We have to filter this, they have to filter it out. The mind is not an empty vessel. As a matter of fact, I'm no longer teaching or retiring. I have often thought, and perhaps even told my students, is that my job is not to drill a hole in students' heads and pour in knowledge in a funnel. My job is that of a vacuum cleaner. I have to get to ears and suck out a lot of stupid things and candy wrappers, and Kleenexes and so forth. In a way, old teaching, perhaps especially nowadays, requires a lot of unteaching. Well, your first thing is somebody who pronounces his name differently. His name is John Lukacs. He is dead now. He's a Marxist thinker. He's no relation to me. And he's at the risk of presumption, or not presumption, highly overrated and hardly readable philosopher. Especially in his native country, he really was more German than Hungarian, and there was a time when he had a considerable intellectual influence. It's all gone now. The second question, I don't know much about the gypsies, and I would agree with you that just think of Poles. Jews were not the only victims of Hitler, but you give give too much credit to the rationality of human beings when you say we have to give equal time and equal justice to everyone. This is not happening, will never happen. Well, this was kind of a fun book to write. I lived in Philadelphia a long time, actually outside of Philadelphia, knew a lot of people. And I attempted to write a portrait of a city from 1900 to 1950 and concentrate, and there are 7 biographical sketches, or no, chapters, on some interesting Philadelphians. Some of them are known, some were known widely, some of them only the Philadelphians. Philadelphia is not what it used to be. Philadelphia used to be a very private city. Philadelphians were very dubious of somebody who had a very wide reputation. They wanted to know the person. That's all gone now, unfortunately. And I want to write about some of them. Some of them are heroes. You're looking at one of my heroines, you know. And some of them were not so hot. Well, there was Agnes Repplier. She's an extraordinary woman, lived to be 95. She was a great American essayist, largely self-educated, extremely learned. Somebody called her, and it's not an exaggeration, the Jane Austen of the essay. You can, a lot of them are out of print, but there was a period around turn of the century when she was pretty widely known. She wrote for the Atlantic Monthly and so forth, and she must have been, I read a lot of her letters, she must have been, she never married, she must have been difficult to get along with. She had a very sharp wit, but she was she was not only brilliant, very learned and very profound, very much worth reading. I have a friend who is a great American literary scholar, I won't mention his name, who read this book and started to read Agnes Repplier. Never heard of her, younger generation, and he quotes her ever since. Edward Bach was, I would say, the least pleasant people among whom I wrote. He was a big operator, a opportunist, who actually took over the Ladies' Home Journal at a time when that meant an awful lot of money, and he was a very shallow, self-satisfied, outwardly agreeable, but essentially disagreeable, narrow man. Yes, because he was a type, you know. Now that's interesting. George Wharton Pater was a mix. Now Bach this is very typical Philadelphia. Bach was not born in Philadelphia, but he made a career in Philadelphia, and by and large cultivating the right people, and people sort of accepted him. Pepper was very much of a native Philadelphian, was a very great Philadelphian lawyer, a learned man, and I include him because of his dualities. You must understand, everybody has dualities, and I only mean good and bad. I mean, people have, some of them have actually split minds, which, you know, Hitler himself had dualities, and one of them is that he talked a great deal and essentially was a very secretive man. Now, George Wharton Pepper, nobody knows him outside Philadelphia, was an interesting, complex character. That's one of the legends, you know, and it's not true. I mean, Hitler wasn't happy about it. It's not true that Hitler spurned Jesse Owens. It's not true. It's a legend. We know that there are books written about this and studies and so forth. Now, I did not say Hitler was not a racist. What I said, actually I have a chapter devoted to my book about this, that racism, even though he helped to propagate it, was not one of his deepest convictions. You know, a person has different convictions, really different ideas. Some are more important than others. This was one which was very important, but it's too simple to say that this was his basic convictions, because we have many an evidence where privately and sometimes even publicly he denies this. Now, the other thing, you know, the racism, now, I'm not speaking of skinheads and neo-Nazis. I don't know them, only what I read in the papers. I don't read very much about this. And I would say that the Southern attitude, the Confederate attitude, is maybe racism was a racism of a very different kind, you know. I mean, no Southerner wanted to kill or eliminate the black race. No Southerner believed that the blacks were the main enemies of the South. See? This is very different. Hitler believed the Jews and their connections and international Jewish conspiracy was the principal, most convinced enemy of Germany. It's a great difference, you see. And another thing is, no Southerner, no American, unless he's a skinhead, so would say that blacks, native blacks, are not Americans. At worst, he would say, yes, but they are second-class Americans. Hitler and the Nazis said Jews are not Germans, including Jews who had lived in Germany for 400 years. Well, I'm very proud that you were a student of mine, because it's a very intelligent question. You know, I wish I knew your name. You know, in a way, yes. Yes, I tell you, yes, there is a great but often unrecognized consciousness of history in America, past 20 or 30 years, which is something quite new. You see, it's 100 years ago that Americans were not interested in history. No, when you look, you know, they had the centennial in Philadelphia in 1876. Except for a few patriotic speeches, nothing was devoted to history. It was all an exhibit of new machinery. Yes, yeah. When the bicentennial comes in 976, the most successful thing are the tall ships. And they are not cigarette boats, you know, they are old ships. I begin this book by something that to me tells very much. As late as the 1920s, in American English, not in English, modern was a good word, and old-fashioned was a bad word. You see, in the 1920s, if you said he's an old-fashioned boy, it means that he's a sissy. By 1970, forget what, the very opposite is true. Who wants to go, if you have a choice, do you want to go to a modern restaurant or to an old-fashioned restaurant? Do you, let's say that all the machinery, heating, plumbing, everything equal, do you want to live in a super modern house or in a real old house? Your little sister is courted by someone. He comes from a very modern family. He comes from an old-fashioned family. Which do you favor? This tells you something. Now, this has all kinds of emanations. Unlike 50 years ago, history books in this country, good and bad ones, sell. Novels do not sell. There are in this country today 3 times as many local historical societies than 50 years ago. And they're not just composed by old ladies in tennis shoes, you know, who look up genealogy. And I think these are fascinating. The appetite for history is here. I do not know, partly because history is something real. It's not just nostalgia. Now, of course, appetite can be badly fed. Appetite can be fed with junk food. And the sad thing is that the academic profession, or let's say many people professional historians, are not quite aware of this. Well, Russell was a friend of mine, and he worked with his publishing house, and he wrote an introduction to this. To my father, you're very nice to ask what his dedications. It's a sentimental thing. All of my books, 20 books, are dedicated either to my family. I've run out of family members now. My wife is the only one who got two dedications, and no, my son or my granddaughter got two too, and some to people I admire. I don't know, maybe that was pompous. I'm afraid I give that impression. In reality, I'm not. Well, you're darling to ask, because I've written 20 books. I don't think it's my most important book, but it's right up there. It's something very, very close to me. This is a writing experiment, but it's not experimental. It's it is not history, and it's not a novel either. It's I would say it's literature soaked in history. Something very early in my life I thought, not because I'm much for innovation, I'd like to try my hand sometime at a new kind of history. In a way, this is it, but it's not history. This is simply a book where there are 69 chapters. Each of them is describing a particular year. 1901, 1902, 1903, ends in 1969. And it describes how imaginary people, but common people, ordinary people, an episode in their lives during that particular year. So, for example, 1941 doesn't deal with Pearl Harbor. For example, 1945 doesn't deal with the atomic bomb. For example, 1914 does not deal with the outbreak of the First World War. And Stalin, Hitler, Mao, Roosevelt, Churchill don't figure in it. Gay is an imaginary person, but, you know, as every writer knows, to some extent, but only to some extent. He's modeled to a friend of mine, who died not in 69, but in 91. You see, there are a lot of writers, besides Edwin Morris now, are trying to do the very opposite of what this book is. They, as Gore Vidal does it, who of course is a much bigger talent than Edwin Morris, but a flawed talent. You know, most talents are flawed, including mine, but his is pretty badly flawed, but never mind. Well, he tries he's interested in history, Gore Vidal, and Morris got a lot of money for this book anyhow. But you see, and you see they will take people, let's talk, Vidal is a better example. He wrote about Wilson, he wrote about Roosevelt, wrote about Lincoln, and who for people who really lived, and ascribes to them to make the portrait richer. Characteristics, acts, desires, words that these people never did. Because he says, this is the kind of person he was. This, in my opinion, is illegitimate. It's wrong. Because there's no evidence for it, and for many ways it is wrong. In many ways, this is wrong. It is interesting that this happens. The reason many writers are trying, in a way the Morris thing is an example of this. In a different way, Susan Sontag, other writers do it. This shows something that I'm very convinced of, and I wrote about this in Historical Consciousness decades ago, that there is now coming about, because of the appetite for history, an increasing confluence of history and the novel. But these birds go about it their own way. They're motivated by the same thing, in a way I am, but they go about it the wrong way. In this book, I only have imaginary people. Well, you stop there. And it's really not one of the better vignettes, but anyhow, this is interesting because, you see, nobody writes or thinks something out of nothing. You know, the mind is not a blank thing, and as I told you, we live forward, but we can only think backwards. But this particular person is very imaginary. This is not modeled after anyone. You know, it's a composite type. Now his wife, you know, I don't know, all right. And this is not one of the best chapters. But I'm using it where a new kind of opportunist who is different from Machiavelli, this person in this vignette, all these are vignettes, He's typical of his times. 1966, university. He's not even a politically correct person. But this person will propose at a faculty meeting that we should have Afro-American studies, even though he has no interest in it, even though he has no sympathy for blacks, But he thinks this will put him in the limelight. There'll be an article from the student paper. He will get a promotion and all that. And there always have been people like that. What is relatively new about him, he thinks this is what the mind is for. Do you see what Machiavelli says about the opportunist? Machiavelli is outdated. What he says about the opportunist is, he says to the prince, you have to say some things that you don't believe at times, because this is the way. You can't say everything that you believe. You have to do it. Now this person, and at the risk of political impertinence, let me say, this person is like George W. Bush. George W. Bush believes what he says. It doesn't mean anything, you see. He thinks this is what the mind is for, to represent ideas. They are popular and they are in. A great friend of mine, I mentioned him once on a program, Richard Snow, the editor of American Heritage magazine. I said, he's a friend, he's a great friend also of my family. Well, I'm not like, you know who the Vicar of Bray is. The Vicar of Bray is the person who always sat on the fence. He didn't know which way. He wanted to have safe on both sides. Now, I'm no Vicar of Bray, ma'am, but I'm also a hibernophile. Not only an Anglophile, but also a hibernophile, which means very friendly, very fond of the Irish, And I think this is a very complicated thing, and of course has very brutal and bad consequences now, especially in the North. But I think the English have a lot to be blamed for. But in some ways, at times, so do the Irish. You cannot put this exactly and measure them like an apothecary, 2 plates on a balance. And I think there is more that connects them than what separates them. And here the most important thing is their culture and their civilization and their institutions and the English language, in the use of which the Irish writers, but Irish common people often have been marvelous. Well, it all depends which. They are published in England, some of my books published in Sweden, Holland, Switzerland, some in France, Italy, Hungary. I speak few languages, which is not a merit, because my native language is a very isolated one. The Hungarian language is not a Slavic language. It is not a Germanic language. It's not a Romance language. So Hungarians who were educated had to know languages. Yes, well, I tell you, that's what's wrong with the conservative movement, what's wrong with the conservatives then. They cheered McCarthy to the heavens because he was anti-communist and so forth, even though he was ready to do great harm to the American political process and the Constitution. He did a great deal of harm. McCarthy was a nationalist radical. McCarthy was a clever but ruthless demagogue who was indisciplined. In the end, the poor man, I'm not going to kick a man who's down, he drank himself to death. So these people who still admire McCarthy, like this guy Herman, I haven't read his book, and even a friend of mine who is now sort of waffling about McCarthy, Bill Buckley, forget about McCarthy. McCarthy got his comeuppance, but in the meantime, he caused a great deal of harm, including harm to American foreign policy, and somebody who was the author of warnings about Russia, George Kennan, was aware of that at that very time. That's an interesting story. Well, it's not interesting, just interesting to me. I'm not a Russian specialist. And I don't deal my teaching. I never dealt with international relations, contemporary history, and so forth. I looked at the entire Cold War then, and I do now. It had very little to do with communism and capitalism, which is some people still don't understand this. Ronald Reagan didn't understand this. You know, the liberals don't understand this. My friend Bill Buckley doesn't understand this. It involved two great powers, America and Russia. And the fact that America was so-called capitalist and Russia so-called communist was an important condition. But it was these two superpowers. And in the 1950s, even though I did not teach Russian history, not my field, I thought there are so many misunderstandings about this thing. So this book is really the relationship of America and Russia in the Cold War, of which communism and capitalism has a chapter. And I felt like I was in the very beginning of my writing career. And I remember, to my great happiness, my then publisher said, well, you write this book, and we'll give you an advance of $1,500. $1,500 was a lot of money for me then. I wrote this book on 14 weekends. It came, but I have been thinking about it for a dozen years. That's devoted to my first wife, to my darling wife, you know, and that's where it stops, you know, no more darling wives, yes. Well, they are two very different books. Paul Johnson, I don't think he's a very good historian. Well, he writes very much, so do I, you know, and he's a little superficial. No, he's very superficial and makes mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes. And he has these great idea books. I think, you know, that if I remember this book, The Birth of the Modern, starts with Einstein and things like that. I mean, he tries to be a deep thinker, and he's such a deep thinker he sinks, you know. He's not very good. Crankshaw is a serious man. He's not a professional historian. I like most of his books. He is critical of Hungarians with some reason at that time. And I read that book many, many, many years ago. And I thought it's a pretty good book. Oh, I'm reading one that's going to be published in this country. English friend of mine. I read an awful lot of books, you know. Very undisciplined. But the best history book, I'm reading a very good book by a young English historian, Andrew Roberts. It will probably be published in this country. It's a long biography of a British Conservative Prime Minister toward the end of the Victorian times, Salisbury. Why should Americans care about Madame Pompadour or Cleopatra or Francis of Assisi, you know? Very intelligent question. And again, we come back to human nature. They knew and they didn't know. And every human being is different. And one of the main elements why people didn't know, they didn't want to know. Do you follow what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. You know, I said this pompously in this program several times. We are responsible for what we think. And what is current today is this materialistic view and emphasis on IQs and brain synapses and so forth, the ability to think. And people, they accept dogma is that some people have the ability to think, some people have less ability to think, or inability to think. That is not it. And what relates to your very serious question is the willingness to think. A lot of us, including ourselves, lots of us, we do want to think about certain things sometimes, some things we shouldn't think about, like our neighbor's wife. And there are a lot of things we are unwilling to think about. I don't think I said that, but the Germans have a tendency to a philosophical idealism, which can be good and bad. What I said in, I think, in the Hitler book was kind of a shocking statement, or in the last European war, and this is again why the Germans are responsible. By and large, the Germans were not the most anti-Semitic people in Europe. If you look at, I mean, people, Russians, Poles, Ukrainians, Romanians, you know, was much more popular. But this is one thing the Germans didn't want to think about. Well, again, two different questions, you know. Everybody asked me three questions, and they're very different. Well, about the second question, you are quite right, but this is a worldwide phenomenon. This is happening everywhere, here in the United States, you know. I mean, when you go to Europe, here and there, in Germany and in some countries, it depends on the families. You can see remnants of certain old-fashioned values and standards and that are now being eroded, and this is perhaps regrettable, and the young react against this, but this, as I told you, what you saw in Germany and disturbed you is worldwide. Now, the other question, well, let me now go out on a limb. You know, I'd like to do that. People say, you like to get in hot water? Well, you have to keep clean, you know. Well, all right. One thing that disturbs me now very much, is that here's a Catholic church, my church, and none of the bishops and none of her made a statement that this poor and now hopelessly confused Cuban boy should go back to his father. I mean, where is the family? Because it will be unpopular. They want to show the conservatives. They don't want to razz the Cubans in Miami and all that. I can't attribute motives to them. But I think this is a sad example of even leaders of our church who want to be Americans first and Catholics second. Well, I am not a leftist, but you could not be more incorrect. You're totally incorrect. Tell me a country in the world today where leftists have come to power. Look, tell me where in the United States, what politician is an extreme leftist? Not one of them. Tell me how many communist people vote in Austria? About 1/10%. Whereas this man Haider, whom I really don't quite regard as a neo-Nazi, got 30% of the vote. How many votes do the communists get in the United States? How many votes do the communists get in Britain, France, Germany, and so forth? You know, I think you are very incorrect. There is a shifting of a political, because this goes back to Marx, because nationalism, and in this country, just think what I spoke about a moment ago about the church's attitude or lack of attitude toward this Cuban boy. Anti-communism is 500,000 times more popular than communism. Well, there is a difference, you know. It is true there are some people, and Lincoln for a very temporary period was toying with the idea that perhaps some Africans should be sent back to Africa, but it never happened. They didn't do it. I mean, not even the most extreme Southerners, you know, were ready to do something like that. And even in the Constitution, or the original Constitution of the United States, you know, which of course had to make a very considerable amount of compromise with the Southern states, including Jefferson, well, blacks were regarded in the census as the equivalent of 3/5 of the whites. The Jews in Germany were not regarded 3/5 Germans. They were regarded as 0 Germans and the enemies of the Germans. Great difference. I think that's a fad. There will be Afrocentric studies. There soon will be, you know, there are lesbian studies, this studies. That's the foam on top of academic fads. Yes, I think that is so, and I think that's also true of not the candidate President Bush. I think it's also true of, to some extent, of Clinton. I'm not giving them history exams, but well, it's not only they don't know much about history. If you don't know much about history and your own history, if you don't know much about your own history, you don't even know yourself. You know, I mean, know thyself means know your own history, know your past. And this is changing now, perhaps very subtly, because these particular presidents, Nixon knew more history than, for example, Ford or Carter, is that nobody really says this in these terms. These were three presidents, perhaps less true of Carter than of Reagan and Ford, who still completely believed in the myth of progress. That things, if it weren't only for the Russians, if it weren't only for bad people in this country, things will get better all the time. What we need is more science, more technology, more democracy. We are now, not only I, an old man and a reactionary, we in the country now have a fair number of people who don't quite think so. Just think about the environment, just think about genetic engineering, just think about the idea the United States has to be policeman of the world, etc. This is now beginning to fade. Well, I could not disagree with you more. Profit is not a common denominator now. Profit was not a common denominator then. Some people think it is. That's why it still moves along. That's why the stocks go up. But this is a myth. You must understand that even in the most materialistic of ages, people don't want money. People want to spend money. Yes, they have to have it, you know. But if they really wanted money, they would hoard it. They would keep it. They would not buy the SUVs, you know. They would not wear the designer label outside, not inside. There are periods of times, there are small, tiny segments of society who are really motivated by profit and greed. Very few people like that. Greed requires a great deal of self-discipline. It means that's all I'm thinking about, not about how my secretary is going to look at me in my $2,000 suit. You know, greed means self-discipline. Greed is privacy. Greed means this is my money. No one's going to touch it. This is mine. Gold coins, I put it under the mattress. That's gone. You know, there are very few people like that. Profit is an accounting device. In the lives of people, most people, profit is a myth. Well, the Cold War ended because of Gorbachev, not because of Reagan. I mean, Reagan had some influence in it. Reagan was very lucky. He became president at a very fortunate situation when the Russians were beginning to crumble and the empire fall apart. I mean, he contributed to it to some extent, but again, this is modern. I'm a historian. This is modern politics. I read in one of my books, I said I didn't like him very much because he was an actor. He played being president. He played it rather well, but if a real crisis would have come, God knows. Oh, what I was trying to do is this. This is, of course, about my native city in 1900. Again, I was between books, and you know, Budapest is very similar to Vienna, you know this, and very close. Now it's only 2.5 hours by train. And there was a great tendency in this country, in England, even in France, in the 70s, early 80s, to write about fin de siècle Vienna, Vienna around 1900. Vienna was everything, Freud, Mahler, and so on. And none of these books mentioned Budapest. If anything, they were patronizing about it. So I said to myself, no, wait a moment, there's a lot of very interesting, and not just second-rate things going on in this rapidly burgeoning and flourishing city around that time. a book ought to be written about this, even though it's not my specialty. But I said I can only do it. That's when I first in my life got a literary agent. You know, in order to do this, I have to go there. You know, not as a tourist. I have to spend 3 or 4 months there in the National Library and read a lot about it. Well, I had an agent who was a marvelous young woman. She got me the contract. I had enough money, and I went there and wrote the book. Well, that's very typical of this. You know, you see, Hungary was about 1850 a rather backward country. Then, and this is, I guess, our national talent, from 1880 to 1910, the rise, not just material, inventions, discoveries, writer, art, you know, flares up in a fantastic way. There are some bad things about it too. And here's one example. I mean, Hungarian engineering. I mean, there were Hungarian inventors. One of them was this man, whose granddaughter, incidentally, I met, you know, who perfected the first electric locomotive. But there are other things like that too. Oh, there is one who died in 1933 by the name of Gyula Krudi, who is a fantastic writer. I think he's better than Proust, but he's very Hungarian, very difficult to translate. It's a Hungarian coffee house, a cafe, you know, where a lot of culture took place, like in Vienna. You know, people met there, authors, writers, argued with each other, had their particular tables. There always is to some extent, but I think the problem is not the distortion of history. The problem is that very little history is being taught and being read. The question is not whether it's American history, Roman history, Greek history. You know very well that you can go through high school nowadays, I'm not exaggerating, and never really read a book. And a lot of this is due to the faults and the pettiness and the narrow-mindedness of the educational establishment. But at the risk of presumption and perhaps shock, a lot of this due to the parents too. The parents pay money to the schools, I'm not only speaking of public schools, and they think the schools are going to do it all. The schools are going to do all education. Schools are going to teach sports, mores, sexuality, manners. That's not the business of the schools. The schools are doing their job. A culture of a nation, the manners and the morals of any nation were never determined by the schools. The schools were a very important instrument, but only one instrument. Well, it's not in the last 100 years, last 50. It's an appetite. The appetite is not being fed. For example, in most high schools, public high schools, there are no history courses. They're called social science. And they involve the necessity of multiculturalism. They give courses on India and Japan and Africa at the expense of American and European history. And you see, this is not just a question of prejudice, or rather selection. You must understand that when we want to know something, we have to begin to know something better that's familiar to us. We have to know something about ourselves, about our family, our people. This is not snobbery. This is not selection. Otherwise, the whole thing becomes abstract. Sir, you couldn't be more wrong. The United States never fought a war with Russia. Communism is a vicious and stupid philosophy of history. It never spread very much. How many communists were there in the United States or in England? I mean, this person who told you this thing about Austria, there was never any communist rule in Austria. The Communist Party in Austria was minimal. The Communist Party in Germany was dwarfed compared to the Nazi Party, you know. Communism was an ism, but precisely because it had been incarnated by the Russians, who are not a very attractive people. It never spread anywhere in Europe except where, at the end of the Second World War, the Russian army appeared. No, I'm not going to write such a book because I'm not a specialist on the subject, and besides, there are umpteen books about this written in Hungary for Hungarians, you know, with different interpretations, some of them good, some of them not so good. And Admiral Horthy was one of an entire list of European, not dictators, but heads of state who presided over a not quite democratic, but certainly not totalitarian country between the two world wars. He was a man of considerable decency. He was a man of somewhat limited intelligence, and he did some harm, he did some good. And a dictator he wasn't. Would have been better if he had been a dictator, he would have been stronger. He was the regent of Hungary after the First World War, and Hungary, however, under him still maintained the essence of a parliamentary system. In the end, the Germans got rid of him. At home, at my desk, you asked me before in the first hour's program about why I lived where I live. To me, it's terribly important where I live. Unfortunately, I live in a very pleasant house, of which one wing is a library. I have a very large personal library. Of course, I can't rely on it all the time. I've got more than 10,000 volumes. I have planned it, it's designed this way. I have a typewriter and that's it. I do not have a word processor. I don't have a computer. I don't want them. Yes, it's electric. In the morning, I have a very lucky marriage because we are unsynchronized. My wife goes to bed late and gets up late. I go to bed early, the older I am, the earlier, and get up early. I feed the dog and the cat, and that's when I start working. After a while, I hear my wife far away, and the only conversation we exchange is, how did you sleep? But as the day advances, especially to dinner, we talk with each other an awful lot. She is very intelligent. I would almost say that she has too many interests. That's, I would say, the least hard thing. The hard thing is the first draft. Yes. Yes, I'm a very good agent. Well, you see, I publish a university press now. I think you can get published without an agent. He was partly, well, he's useful sometimes. He gets the foreign editions. And no, I like him. I have a very good relationship with him. Keep writing. It's a practice, like a pianist. And I don't speak in history. Keep writing about something that you know something about. And you find out more about it. That all depends what book I'm writing. At home or at university libraries and things like that. It sure does. You know, I've written a number of books. I don't have that stuff. I don't want it. I don't want email. I don't want to be bothered. I tell you what I have, which changed my life in some ways to the worse, but in many ways to the better. I do have a fax machine. It changed my life because I can send things very fast, come back. In some ways, it compromised my work because before the fax machine, I had to, you know, I know people abroad, my books are published abroad, so forth. I had to set aside a full day, maybe 2 days, every 2 weeks, to do my correspondence. Now I don't have to do that. But with a fax machine, I somehow feel compelled to address it right away, to answer it that day or next day, you see. And that cuts a little bit into the writing. First, don't write for a publisher, write for yourself. Keep writing. When you really think it's good and worthwhile, then start thinking of a publisher. Oh, I would say half a dozen, and except for one, I never abandoned them. They went out of business, they wasn't interested in what I was doing and things like that. Yes, I don't mind saying in public the Hitler book, which, as you know, has some interest. You have seen the number of callers. 80% of people want to know about Hitler. It's a good book. It was published by Knopf, which is now part of Random House. They have treated me abominably. I don't want to go into details. I still don't know exactly why. I can only tell you the how. But as in every other human endeavor, the why is often implicit in the how. Well, it's a different country. I know a little about it, but not much. But I would hope that Canada keeps going, keeps being a nation. I mean, after all, they have a joint history of 300 years. And there is enough elbow room for the Quebecois to have their own provincial government and the French institutions and, of course, the rule of the French language. I mean, why not? I would not like to see Canada breaking up. But I'll tell you one thing. If Canada breaks up, I would like some of the provinces to be part of the United States, the English-speaking ones. It would strengthen the original character of this country, which is unraveling. Yes, the composition of this country, the ethnic composition of this country, which also means its traditions and institutions. Well, as you know, the political parties do not figure in the Constitution. I mean, an entire conventions, two-party system, primaries grew up as a practice, which has now become a tradition, not in the Constitution. On the other hand, political parties existed from the very beginning. They exist now. How long they will exist? They will not exist forever. How long they will exist, I cannot tell you. One great plus in this country is, sometimes it's a minus, but by and large a plus rather than minus. And who am I to enlighten Americans what they should do? No, I'm just speaking of the past. The real things the great issues that divided the history of the United States very seldom corresponded to divisions between the parties. Very seldom. And the great cries, one of the big parties leaned one way and the other way, but the real division that divided the people into two camps, or the alternatives that the leaders of the country had to face, were very seldom restricted to one party against the other. And I think, by and large, it was a good thing. Well, it is, I say auto-history, not an autobiography, although two things overlap. Let me explain this very simply. Yes, the book is about me, and it is written in the first person singular. But it's not the story of my life, except indirectly. It's a story of my interests, of what I have seen and what I observed. To give you an example, there are chapters in the book. There's one chapter which is entitled Teaching. It's not a history of my teaching career. To some extent it is. It's what I experienced and learned from decades of teaching. The same thing about writing. It's not a history of my publishing career. It's in there, here and there, but it is what moved me, what mistakes I made, what I learned about writing. Well, it was in a dirty room of one of the federal buildings in Philadelphia. There were all kinds of people who were sworn in being citizens. There was a judge who was obviously bored with the whole thing, and it was on a slightly higher level, but not much, than appearing in a traffic court. I knew John. I think John is still alive. I criticized his Hitler book, a little bit of Hitler history, but not very much. John Toland is much, much better than Irving and so forth. John Toland, John is did a lot of interesting research, met people. John Toland is also a good writer. And there's not much I can disagree with him. His Hitler of history is here and there maybe a little shallow, but it's not a bad book. It's a very sad thing. This goes back because I have many friends who are historians, but they're scattered all around the country. For example, I know, I lived in the Philadelphia area, well, Greater Philadelphia now for 54 years. I have 1, 2, 3, 4 historian friends, that's it. Well, most of them are really not interested in me, and so consequently I'm not very interested in them. Many years ago, and I wrote for the National Review, then I dropped out, I argued with him, but Buckley is Bill Buckley is a very generous person. He will take disagreement. I never said that Churchill was motivated by love. I never put it that way. And I didn't even say that Hitler was motivated by hatred, but he cultivated hatred very strongly. He also thought that this would appeal to some people. But I never said that Churchill was motivated by love. Churchill was no Mother Teresa. Well, first of all, Germany was closer to England than Russia. And Germany had the ability, which Hitler then demonstrated, to rule most of Europe, which Russia never did. He was very much aware of that. And other things that I answered in questions that were directed to me during this program, how did the communist parties in Germany and Europe compare in appeal to the Nazi Party? As 1 to 6, 1 to 7, 1 to 8. You see, Churchill, once the war begins, Churchill's position is very clear. And he doesn't say it in too many words, but he says there are 2 alternatives here. We alone cannot defeat Germany. Hitler's Germany is so powerful, we cannot defeat it. We might stop it, but we cannot conquer it. Eventually, with the Americans, perhaps with the Russians, we will defeat them. The alternative is all Europe dominated by Germany, or the eastern half of Europe dominated by Russia, and half of Europe is better than none. This is very difficult for me to say because I'm not a current writer. I'm not a national psychologist. About Croatia, I cannot tell you more than what everybody knows. Yugoslavia fell apart, and some horrible things had happened there, not only now, but in the entire 20th century by just about all sides. Some were worse than the others, and it shows that human nature does not change. These tribal hatreds continue to exist and continue to exist now. About the Hungarian people, whether they're close, I don't know. This is I cannot speculate about this. Perhaps this involves a class difference. Perhaps tourists or foreigners who came to Hungary in the past, were meeting a population that was more easygoing, bohemian, and so forth. But it was a very small portion of the population. Hungary now is a very fully democratized society, by which I mean that, yes, there are some new rich, but by and large, the great class differences have disappeared or have been weakening, the class differences. And when something like this happens in society, the character of the nation undergoes a difference. Listen, this happened in the United States too. If you look at a picture of Uncle Sam, the way they began to draw him in the 1830s, he's a very gaunt and thin man. Americans are rather fat people nowadays. The early Americans were described as very puritanical, very thrifty with their money, and just think of the Yankees, not loquacious at all, talking very little. Is this the American character now? In many ways, the American character is the very opposite. Well, it's a study of the people who have written about Hitler. It's a description of the city when it was at its peak 100 years ago. It's, if I may say, a rather imaginative reconstruction how ordinary, or not ordinary, how different people were thinking and behaving during each different year of the century. The relationship of the duel between Churchill and Hitler at a period when Churchill could have won the war. Hitler could have won the war. It's a duel within duel. Within the duel, the troubles and difficulties Churchill had in carrying his will through in May 1940. A whole combination, a collection of historic places I visited. A portrait of interesting people in Philadelphia during the first half century. A kind of an auto-history about the history of my thoughts and experiences, but not really an autobiography. History of the first part of the Second World War, from 1939 to Pearl Harbor. A history of American-Russian relations from way back until about 1960. An attempt to a somewhat unorthodox history of the United States in the 20th century. Certain essays about how an entire age is passing. The same theme, but written in a different form. 6 long letters exchanged between George Kennan and myself about the history of the origins of the Cold War. Problem about what is the nature of our knowledge of the past? Thank you.